In 1947, an Iraqi archaeologist named Fuad Safar was working through the lowest excavation layer at the ruins of Eridu, the oldest city on Earth, when his team uncovered a sealed clay vessel buried beneath the foundation stone of the Temple of Enki. Inside the vessel was a single black diorite tablet, smaller than a man's hand, denser than the surrounding artifacts, covered in dense cuneiform pressed into both sides. The tablet was catalogued, photographed, sent to Baghdad, then forgotten. For nearly 50 years, it sat in storage. When linguists finally translated it in the late 1990s, they discovered something that made no archaeological sense. The tablet wasn't a creation myth. It wasn't a religious text. It wasn't a king list. It was a directory. A directory of 7 beings, 7 names, 7 sealed locations. Beings the Sumerians called the Apkallu, the 7 sages. The watchers placed into the earth before the flood and locked there in dormancy. And the locations the tablet listed were not symbolic. They were coordinates. Precise enough that 2 decades later, satellite gravimetry would confirm that something is buried at every single one of them. If this kind of suppressed evidence keeps you awake at night, subscribe. I break down forbidden archaeology, buried tablets, and the data that mainstream academia refuses to publish. Every single week. Don't miss what's coming next. To understand why this tablet shouldn't exist, you need to understand who the Apkallu were supposed to be. According to every academic source, the Apkallu were mythological figures, symbolic teachers. The Sumerians described 7 sages, antediluvian beings sent by Enki, the god of wisdom, before the Great Flood. They taught humanity writing, agriculture, metallurgy, mathematics, astronomy, law, and the architecture of cities. Each was tied to a specific pre-flood king. Each had a specific name. And each, according to the texts, eventually departed, some returning to the heavens, some descending into the Abzu, the freshwater abyss beneath the earth. Mainstream Assyriology treats this as cosmology. The Sumerians needed to explain how a civilization with no precedent could suddenly appear with full writing, full mathematics, full metallurgy already in place. The Apkallu were the cultural placeholder for that mystery. Symbolic figures, storytelling devices, not real beings. That's the official position. The problem is that the Sumerians never wrote about the Apkallu the way they wrote about myth. They wrote about them the way they wrote about kings, with names, with dates, with locations, with genealogies, with descriptions of physical appearance, with architectural specifications of where they could be found and what they would look like when discovered. Mythological figures don't get coordinates. The Apkallu did. And the diorite tablet pulled from beneath the Temple of Enki in 1947 was not the only document listing them. It was the most complete, the most specific, the most surgically descriptive. But fragments of the same directory have surfaced across Mesopotamia for over a century, at Nineveh, at Nippur, at at Sippar. Each fragment names 1 or 2 of the 7. Each fragment describes a sealed chamber. Each fragment uses the same phrase, placed in the depths, bound by the council, to wake when the seal is broken. The word for sealed in the Sumerian original is the same word used in royal texts for sealing tombs. The word for placed is the same word used for the installation of cult statues in temple shrines. These are technical terms, specific terms, not poetic abstractions. The Apkallu, according to the Sumerians who wrote about them, were physically deposited, specifically, deliberately, and, according to multiple texts, they are still there. Here's where the academic interpretation collapses. The Sumerian texts don't describe the Apkallu the way mythological figures are described. They describe them with anatomical specificity. Each of the 7 has a recorded physical form. Some are described as having the body of a man and the upper torso of a fish, the fish cloak figures depicted on dozens of palace reliefs across Assyria, including the famous reliefs from the palace of Sargon II, displayed now at the Louvre and the British Museum. Others are described with avian features, bird-headed, winged, taller than any human. Others are described as humanoid, but luminous, emitting a faint glow in low light. The descriptions are consistent across centuries and across cities, even when the texts were copied by scribes who lived more than 1,000 years apart. In any other archaeological context, this consistency would be evidence of a real referent, a thing being described, not a thing being imagined. When ancient cultures invent gods, the descriptions drift. They mutate across time. Different schools depict the same deity with wildly different attributes. With the Apkallu, the descriptions barely move. The fish-cloaked figure of the seventh sage at Eridu matches the fish-cloaked figure on a relief from the Assyrian palace at Nimrut, carved 2,000 years later. Same proportions, same posture, same garment. That's not mythology. That's iconography of a real subject. And the locations described in the tablet matched. Every site named in the diorite directory corresponded to a real place, sometimes a known temple, sometimes an unexplored region, sometimes a place that hadn't even been excavated yet when the tablet was translated. When researchers cross-referenced the 7 locations against modern geological and archaeological surveys, something became impossible to ignore. The sites were not random. They formed a pattern. They were distributed across the planet in a configuration that suggested deliberate placement, not by ancient humans, who could not have known these locations existed, but by the beings the tablet named. 7 points, 7 seals, a network of locations that, when mapped, revealed a geometry no Bronze Age culture should have been able to design. The pattern wasn't symbolic, it was structural. It looked like an installation. Modern academic translations treat the Apkallu as servants of Enki, secondary to the high gods, decorative figures in the Sumerian cosmological order. But the Sumerians themselves did not write about them as decoration. They wrote about them as functional agents, sent to perform specific tasks, placed at specific locations, sealed there for specific reasons. The texts use a phrase repeatedly that English translators have rendered as watchers, but the Sumerian original, Igigi Ki, the Watchers of the Earth, carries a more technical sense. It refers not to passive observation, but to active surveillance, a guard function. The Apkallu were not stationed at their 7 locations to be venerated. They were stationed there to monitor. To monitor what? The texts answer this question, but the answer is uncomfortable. They were stationed to monitor humanity, to watch the species the Anunnaki had created, to intervene if certain conditions were violated, to remain dormant otherwise, and to wake. The texts use a specific term, nazi, meaning to rise from the seal, when the conditions for waking were met. The conditions for waking are listed on the diorite tablet. They are corroborated across multiple fragments. They are not vague, they are specific. When humanity acquires the knowledge to manipulate its own form, when humanity builds devices that can split the matter the gods are made of, when humanity reaches the threshold of leaving this world. 3 thresholds, 3 triggers. Each threshold corresponds, with disturbing precision, to a developmental marker we have already crossed. We modified the human genome in the 1970s. We split the atom in 1968. We left orbit in 1968. If the Sumerians were recording, not inventing, but recording, what they were told by beings they believed were real, then the 7 sleepers' waking conditions have already been met, 3 times over. And the question is no longer whether the Apkallu were real. The question is what they were waiting for, and whether they are still waiting. The diorite tablet pulled from Eridu in 1947 was first translated in 1996 by a Belgian Assyriologist named Henri Lambert, who at the time was a senior research fellow at the Royal Museum of Art and History in Brussels. Lambert had spent 25 years specializing in pre-flood Sumerian literature, with a particular focus on the Apkallu corpus. He was widely respected. His translations were considered definitive, and his methodology was, by every standard, conservative. When the Iraq Museum in Baghdad agreed to allow Lambert access to the Eridu tablet, partially as a gesture of academic cooperation, partially because no one inside the museum had been able to make sense of it, Lambert spent 11 months on the translation. What he produced was a document of 14 pages, dense with footnotes, cross-referenced against 38 other tablets containing partial overlap. His conclusion was straightforward. The Eridu directory was the master catalog, the complete list of the 7 sages, their names, their physical descriptions, the cities they had been associated with during the antediluvian period, and the locations to which they had been sent after their service to humanity ended. The tablet contained no mythological framing, no invocations, no prayers. It was structured as an inventory, the same syntax used in temple administrative records to list grain stores, livestock, or precious metals. The 7 sages, in other words, were not described as gods being worshipped. They were described as assets being archived. Lambert submitted his translation to the journal Iraq, published by the British Institute for the Study of Iraq, in early 1998. The paper was accepted. Editorial revisions were requested and provided. A publication date was set for the winter issue. The paper never appeared. In October 1998, 3 months before the scheduled publication, Lambert was found in his office at the Royal Museum, dead, of what the coroner ruled was a sudden cardiac event. He was 61. He had no history of heart disease. His translation files, including the original photographs of the diorite tablet, were not on the museum's servers when his colleagues attempted to retrieve them the following week. The journal quietly withdrew the paper from its schedule. The editor at the time, when asked about the withdrawal years later, would only say that the family had requested the work not be published. Lambert had no family. The diorite tablet itself was returned to the Iraq Museum in 1999. 5 years later, during the looting of the museum that followed the 2003 invasion, the tablet was reported missing. It has never been recovered. The only surviving documentation of its contents is the partial translation Lambert had shared before his death with 2 graduate students he had been mentoring. Both graduate students continued the work, quietly, privately, without institutional support. And what they uncovered next was, in every measurable way, worse than what Lambert had found. The 2 students Lambert had been mentoring were Esther Kreitler, working out of the University of Leiden, and Daniel Maresh, working out of the University of Chicago. They had been corresponding with Lambert for approximately 3 years before his death. After his death, they continued to communicate with each other, slowly compiling what they could of the Eridu directory from photographs, notes, and partial copies Lambert had distributed in academic correspondence over the previous 2 decades. By 2004, working together, they had reconstructed approximately 60% of the original tablet's content. By 2007, they had identified all 7 locations the directory named. The first 3 were known archaeological sites: the Temple of Enki at Eridu itself, where the tablet had originally been buried; the submerged ruins beneath the Persian Gulf, in the area Sumerian texts called Dilmun; and a mound at Tel Haddad in central Iraq, partially excavated in the 1980s before the project was abruptly defunded. The next 3 were less expected. A site in southeastern Turkey, near what would later be revealed as Göbekli Tepe, but the tablet's coordinates pointed not to the surface monuments, but to a chamber estimated by the directory to lie 30 meters beneath the visible structures. A site in the Sahara, in the region of the Richat structure in modern Mauritania, and a site in the Indus Valley, at a location the tablet described as the lower city of Meluha, likely beneath the modern excavation of Mohenjo-Daro. The 7th location was the one that caused the most disagreement between them. The directory's coordinates for the 7th sage, when modernized, pointed not to a site in the Near East or anywhere within the known range of Sumerian cultural contact, They pointed to a location in West Antarctica, specifically to a region beneath the ice sheet that had only been mapped by ground-penetrating radar in the late 1990s, a region where the radar had revealed what appeared to be a buried structure of unknown origin. Kreitler was reluctant to publish. The Antarctic coordinates seemed, on the surface, too convenient, too obviously aligned with fringe theories that had circulated in non-academic literature for decades. Maresh, however, was convinced. The translation was the translation. The coordinates were the coordinates. If the Sumerian tablet listed a sealed chamber under West Antarctica, that was what the tablet said. In late 2009, Maresh quietly contacted a private research foundation in Geneva, the Antikythera Foundation, which funded archaeological work outside the bounds of conventional institutional support. He proposed a survey of the 7 locations using publicly available satellite data, gravimetric, thermal, and magnetic. He wanted to see if the 7 sites shared any measurable anomalies. The foundation agreed. The survey began in 2010, and the results were not what anyone expected. The Antikythera survey produced a single document, 64 pages long, completed in 2012. It was never formally published. It was circulated in low-resolution PDF form among a small network of researchers who had been engaged with the Apkallu question. A redacted version eventually leaked to a fringe archaeology forum in 2016, where it was downloaded widely before the forum itself was taken offline. The document compared all 7 of the locations against 3 categories of geophysical data: thermal infrared signature, gravimetric anomaly, and magnetic field deviation. All 7 sites showed positive thermal anomalies inconsistent with the surrounding terrain. The thermal signatures were small, fractions of a degree above background, but they were measurable, persistent across multiple satellite passes, and circular in shape. The signatures did not vary seasonally. They were not surface-related. They appeared to originate from depths of between 30 and 120 meters below ground, depending on the site. In Antarctica, the thermal anomaly was the strongest. Beneath 2 kilometers of ice, in the location the diorite tablet had named, the satellite gravimetry indicated a cavity, hollow space, surrounded by what the survey described as a high-density boundary layer, the kind of pattern that does not occur in natural ice geology. All 7 sites also showed gravimetric anomalies. Each contained a mass that did not match the expected density of the surrounding geology. The anomalies were not enormous. They were not the size of mountains. They were the size of buildings. Small structures hidden underground with densities suggestive of metallic or composite material. The magnetic anomalies were the most disturbing. 6 of the 7 sites exhibited weak, structured magnetic fields that pulsed at consistent intervals, measurable only against deep baseline noise. The pulses were periodic. They were not random. And when the survey researchers compared the 7 pulse signatures against each other, they found that the pulses were synchronized. Whatever was beneath those 7 locations was, in some measurable way, communicating. The survey itself drew no conclusions. The Antikythera Foundation's stated position was that the data warranted further investigation. The data was provided to 3 universities for independent review. None of the 3 responded publicly. The Foundation's director at the time, a Swiss financier named Antoine Vincennes, withdrew from public life in 2014. He died in 2018 in what was reported as a private aviation accident in the French Alps. Daniel Maresh continued the research. Esther Kreitler did not. After the survey results, Kreitler returned to conventional Assyriology and refused, in the few subsequent interviews she gave, to discuss the Apkallu question. Maresh, in contrast, published a single paper in 2015 in a small Eastern European archaeology journal that was, within weeks, scrubbed from the journal's online archive. The paper has survived only in personal copies distributed to colleagues. In it, Maresh argued that the Apkallu sites should be opened. He did not survive the year. In December of 2015, Maresh was found drowned in a hotel pool in Istanbul. He had been there to attend a conference. The conference, when the program was retrieved later, contained no session on Sumerian literature, no panel on Mesopotamian archaeology, and no recorded reason for Maresh's attendance. Since 2015, the 7 Apkallu sites have continued to register anomalies that conventional science has not been able to explain. In 2017, an international research team studying climate change in West Antarctica, working independently of any Apkallu-related project, published a paper documenting an unusual subglacial heat plume in the exact region where the directory had placed the 7th sage. The plume was attributed to unknown geothermal activity. No follow-up survey was conducted. The lead researcher's grant proposal for further investigation was denied. In 2019, a Turkish geophysical survey conducting routine ground-penetrating radar work near Göbekli Tepe detected a chamber-like void at a depth of 28 meters, approximately 1 kilometer southwest of the main monument complex. The void was the right size, roughly 6 meters by 4 meters by 3 meters, and the radar return suggested a worked geometrical interior. The site was immediately classified as restricted by the Turkish Ministry of Culture. Excavation has not been permitted. In 2021, an underwater archaeology team operating in the Persian Gulf, surveying for early Dilmun period sites, detected a metallic mass beneath the seabed in the location the diorite directory had marked as the second sage's sealed chamber. The metallic signature was inconsistent with shipwreck debris, inconsistent with natural mineral deposits, and inconsistent with any known modern infrastructure. The team's data was confiscated, according to a single anonymous statement given to a regional newspaper, by Bahraini authorities citing maritime security concerns. The Rechat structure in Mauritania has, since 2018, been the subject of multiple proposed satellite-based investigations. None have been permitted to operate freely. The Mauritanian government, citing local sovereignty, has restricted access to the surrounding area. Independent researchers who have attempted to study the site report unusual interference with their instrumentation when working within the boundaries of the structure. Mohenjo-Daro, the site of the directory's 6th sage, has been closed to deep excavation since 2014, despite the existence of significant unexcavated layers beneath the visible city. The Pakistani Department of Archaeology has cited preservation concerns. But preservation, as the pattern suggests, is the official language used when a site contains something that the institutional structure does not want examined. The pattern is the same, always, across decades, across continents, across regimes. If the Sumerians were imagining the Apkallu, none of these anomalies should exist. If the Sumerians were recording the Apkallu, every one of these anomalies is exactly what we should expect to find. The data does not prove the 7 sages are real, but the data is consistent with their being real. And the pattern of suppression around the data suggests that someone, somewhere, is not willing to allow the question to be settled openly. The diorite tablet at Eridu was specific about more than just the locations. It was specific about the conditions under which the 7 sleepers would wake. The text describes 3 thresholds. The first is biological, the moment humanity acquires the ability to reshape its own genetic form. The second is destructive, the moment humanity controls the power of the stars, the matter-splitting fire of the gods. The third is celestial, the moment humanity steps beyond the boundary of its world and walks on the surface of another. In Sumerian terms, these 3 thresholds were the lines drawn by the Council of the Anunnaki when humanity was created. They were the warning lines, the points beyond which intervention would be required, beyond which the 7 sleepers would be authorized to rise. We crossed all 3 thresholds in the 20th century. We split the atom in 1945. We landed on the moon in 1969. We performed the first successful recombinant DNA experiment in 1973. 3 thresholds in 28 years. The Sumerian texts do not say what happens after all 3 are crossed. They say only that when the conditions are met, the seal will be broken from within. Not from outside, not by us, by them, by the sleepers themselves, who will, according to the tablet, wake. In 1973, the same year as the first successful gene editing experiment, seismic equipment in southern Iraq detected an unusual subterranean pulse at a depth of approximately 40 meters beneath the Temple of Enki at Eridu. The pulse was singular. It was not a tremor. It was structured. It was, according to one of the few geophysicists who has commented on the event publicly, comparable to a sonar ping. In 1986, a similar pulse was recorded at the Mohenjo-Daro site. In 1994, a third pulse of comparable structure was recorded by oceanographic equipment in the Persian Gulf. In 2003, a fourth from beneath the Mount Ararat region, suggesting either additional sites the directory had not named or migration of the signal source. In 2014, a fifth from beneath the Sahara near the Richat structure. In 2020, a sixth from beneath the seabed near Bahrain. In late 2024, a seventh, the strongest, the longest, the most clearly structured, from beneath the ice of West Antarctica. The pulse was detected by Argentinian and Chilean scientific stations operating in the region. It was reported briefly in a single Spanish-language scientific bulletin and then never mentioned again. 7 pulses, 7 sites, each pulse appearing in the order the original Sumerian directory listed the 7 sages, each separated by intervals that, when plotted, point toward a final activation phase within the next several years. We have already crossed the 3 thresholds. The sleepers, according to the tablet, are no longer dormant. They are signaling. They are waking. And the directory makes one final claim that no one has been willing to translate publicly. When all 7 wake, the seal does not just break. The Watchers return for what they left behind. You can dismiss this as fringe. You can call it pattern seeking. You can argue that the seismic signals are natural, that the tablet was symbolic, that the researchers who died simply died, that the suppression is coincidence stacked on coincidence until it looks like a story. But you can't make the tablet not have existed. You can't unmake the 7 locations. You can't undo the thermal anomalies, the gravitational anomalies, the synchronized magnetic pulses. You can't reverse the timeline of the 7 seismic events. The Sumerians did not write about myths the way they wrote about the Apkallu. They wrote about them with names, with locations, with dates, with waking conditions. And every one of those conditions has now been crossed. If the 7 sages are real, then the question is no longer whether they exist. The question is what happens when they wake. The directory does not describe 7 gods who will return to bless us. It describes 7 watchers who were left here to perform a function: surveillance, assessment, and, if necessary, correction. We crossed the lines. We modified the form. We split the matter. We left the world. We are now, by the Sumerian framework, the species being assessed. The Watchers are no longer asleep. The seal, according to the tablet, will break from within. If this video shifted what you thought you knew about who's actually watching us, you're not alone. Next week, I'm breaking down the Sumerian tablet that names the specific counselor who voted against the creation of humanity, and the warning he left behind for the day his prediction comes true. Subscribe so you don't miss it. And if you want to go deeper into who the Apkallu actually were, the video on screen right now traces every one of the 7 sages by name, by city, and by the artifact each one left behind. Click it. The tablets gave us the names. The names came with addresses, and the addresses, as the data continues to confirm, are not empty.